Hey Research Stat 1 class, this is Stephanie, and today's video is all about scientific thinking and critical thinking. So you've been reading chapter 1 in the book, and one of the big ideas in the first part of the chapter is scientific thinking along with critical thinking. And I think that today, a lot of people get these two things confused because they think, well, if I'm using scientific thinking, then I must also be using critical thinking. And while the two are definitely related in incredibly important ways, they're not the same thing. So scientific thinking allows us to utilize things like variables and control to explore ideas that we want to test empirically, right? We have a question that we want to ask and we are trying to get an answer. Critical thinking is a little bit different than that. Critical thinking involves exploring different ways, different perspectives, different ways of thinking about the same problem. And you can think about questions using critical thinking that you can't actually answer with scientific thinking. So scientific thinking is then very different than critical thinking because we actually can use scientific thinking to explore questions in empirical ways where critical thinking does not necessarily require that. That said, critical thinking is incredibly important in scientific thinking. And I would actually argue that that's incredibly important, especially in the science of psychology. Like I've said before, right? Psychology is the hardest science. And so if that's true, if psychology is the hardest science, if that's what we're going to say, one of the things that makes it the hardest science is that often we have competing or conflicting information. And I'm actually going to use a non-psychological example of this. So many years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, there was this study that was published that basically said that it was not just a good thing, but like a super healthy thing for women to have a glass of alcohol each day. That study found that women who had about a serving of alcohol a day did better on mental health measures. They had less ovarian cancer. They had all kinds of health benefits, at lower breast cancer incidences, etc. And they didn't follow them for a really long time, but they did follow them long enough so that there were some what they felt were conclusive results. About a year later, a study was published that showed that women who have an alcoholic drink a day are significantly more likely to suffer from depression and more likely to suffer from ovarian cancer, blood clots, like all these horrible things. And so imagine this, right? You hear a study like that and you start drinking a glass of alcohol a day because you hear the first one that says it's a wonder drug. And then a year later, after you've been doing this for 365 days, you hear, oh my God, you've ruined your life. Right? Okay, so scientific thinking is the idea that we can test if alcohol is a benefit to us in terms of our health. But in order to think about this scientifically, we have a number of things to consider, right? Like, number one, what do we even mean when we mean health? Because there's physical health, there's mental health, there's overall subjective well-being, right? All of those are ways that we can measure health. So what we're going to see in chapter 3 is that we're going to have to really start to think about what do we mean when we say that we want to explore something scientifically, because all of those components are really important. One of the interesting things in that first study, what they did is they had women actually keep a diary of their alcohol ingestion, and they trained them to understand what like a serving of alcohol actually is, right? In the second study, they didn't do that. They actually asked women to estimate about how much they had to drink per week over the last, I believe it was 6 months. It was a bizarre retrospective study. And the other problem with doing a retrospective study, so first of all, right, you might not even be able to really estimate what that looks like. For me, I don't typically drink, but I always have champagne on New Year's. Always. I love to have champagne on New Year's. And every once in a while, I'll have like a drink. Like if we like to go to Las Vegas. If we're at the Wynn, I love their mojitos. So I might have a mojito, which isn't something that I would normally do. So I'd really have to think like, okay, in the last 6 months, like did New Year's happen? Did I go to the Wynn and have a mojito? I'd have to think about those things really hard. That's hard for me because I rarely drink. But now imagine that you drink all the time. And you might drink different amounts depending on like what friends are in town and what holidays there are. Retrospectively speaking, that's a really difficult question to answer for most people. So when we think about the idea of scientific thinking, we have to be thinking about how are those variables defined? How well were they controlled? We have to be able to utilize that kind of thinking so that we can next employ critical thinking. Because I just told you about two studies that on the face of them seem pretty similar. The questions are certainly the same. Is alcohol a benefit to health in women, right? Both studies were trying to come up with an answer, but they came up with two very different answers. And so what we have to do then is we have to start using our brain, our critical thinking brain, to evaluate those two studies, to evaluate the extent to which we believe that they were well done studies, and the extent to which we believe that we can kind of count on those results and maybe utilize them in our own lives. So when I think about those two studies, one was done relatively well. They trained women to understand what a serving was. They had women keep a diary, so they weren't having to remember 6 months of drinking. They were having to remember their day's worth of drinking, which is a lot easier to do, I guess, unless you've had a lot to drink, right? But that study in that way was really well done. The second study asked women to estimate how many drinks they had had per week. That's very different than a per day situation also, right? So you might drink a lot on the weekends, and if I average that out to a week, right? So let's say you have 7 drinks every Friday and Saturday night, combined, right? 3 on Friday, 4 on Saturday, and that's your typical. If I average that out into a week, that would look like 1 serving a week. Or I'm sorry, one serving a day, right? For each day of the week. But your reality is really different. You're having a lot of alcohol on 2 days during the week. So that measure, that it was retrospective, that it was asking per week as opposed to per day, those are two really different things. The other issue with that study is that women were not necessarily trained to understand what a serving of alcohol was. If I ask you how many drinks you've had, you might have 1 margarita on Friday night and 1 margarita on Saturday night, and that's your norm. And you're going to tell me 2 drinks. But did you know that the average margarita in San Antonio, Texas, has approximately 3 shots of alcohol? In other words, it's 3 servings. So it's 1 drink. Yeah, you get it all in 1 glass, but it's 3 servings of alcohol. And the women in the first study were trained to recognize what a serving was and to account for multiple servings in a single drink. Whereas women in the second study were just asked, how many drinks did you have? And they would write that down. But a drink is not necessarily a serving. And that's a really big difference there. So it makes a lot of sense that these two studies, when you actually get down to them and you critically evaluate those studies, they are done in totally different ways. And this is why critical thinking is so important in science. It's not just looking at the research and saying, oh, this is what people are saying they found. It's looking at the research with a critical eye, evaluating it, tearing it apart, thinking about what could have gone better, what could have gone worse, what did they do well, what did they do what did they need improvement on. And those are the things that I'm going to ask you to be doing this semester. So this weekend you have a assignment to find a article. It releases for you today. But I have an extra credit assignment, and this is one way that I'm evaluating who's watching the videos and who's not. So along with that assignment that's due Sunday, which is just to find an article, you have an extra credit opportunity to critically evaluate that article. When you turn in your article, then, those of you who have watched this video and want to take part in an extra credit opportunity have a chance to earn up to 10 extra credit points by critically evaluating that article. This does not need to be an APA format. You can try to do that if you want to practice that cover page and stuff like that. You absolutely must have your in-text citations. That not doing that is plagiarism, right? So you need to have your in-text citations. It's a good opportunity to practice those as well. Other than that, there doesn't need to be an APA format, so you don't need to worry too much about like spacing and all that other stuff. I just want to see your brain working. I want to see if you can apply some of the critical thinking ideas that you read about in the Critical Thinking Habits article that I posted for you, some of the ones that are discussed in your book, and then can you take those ideas and apply them to an article, because that's what we're really going to be doing for the rest of the semester. So this first one is practice, and I pay you to do it, right? With up to 10 extra credit points. So find an article, find that research article. There are stipulations in that assignment. You'll see those when you look at the assignment. And then when you have the chance, critically evaluate that article. I just want to see, like I said, I just want to see your brain working. All right, you guys, that's it for critical and scientific thinking. And you have another video coming at you in a little bit about chapter 2. Make sure that you carve out the time to watch that before next Tuesday. Thanks. Bye.